Are you planning to upgrade your boat refrigerator? Or are you perhaps installing one for the first time? It's a little more challenging than just going to a store to buy a standard model like you would in a house. I'm Carolyn Sherlock, and on this episode of the Boat Galley podcast, I'll share the basics of boat refrigerations you need to know to install the best option for you and your boat. But first, are you looking for a one-stop shop for all your Pacific Northwest cruising needs? Northwest Explorations offers bareboat charters, guided flotillas, powerboat training, service, detailing, and brokerage. Located on the Washington coast and Vancouver Island, you're covered no matter which side of the border you're on. Visit nwexplorations.com to learn more. If you're installing a boat refrigerator for the first time or doing a major upgrade on your existing system, you may be overwhelmed by the decisions you're having to make simultaneously. I'm hoping that I can give you a few thoughts to provide a framework. Like many things in cruising, from your choice of boat to the route you take, there are no universal answers in choosing a boat refrigerator system. But understanding how one decision will impact others can narrow down the range of appropriate choices for your situation. Okay, there's 4 parts to a boat refrigerator. Adding or upgrading a boat refrigerator isn't like going out to an appliance store, buying the one that looks pretty to you, and having it delivered. On a boat, you're going to have to consider these 4 items: power and how you'll supply it, where you'll install the compressor, the box, in other words, the size, location, and construction must all be considered, and finally, what brand. They have to work together to make having refrigeration pleasant as opposed to a frustration. Okay, let's talk about power. For most cruisers, the first question with regards to refrigeration are, how much power will it use, and how can I provide that power? Your other choices will determine how much power the refrigerator uses, as will even things like your choice of how you power it. If your refrigerator is next to the engine compartment, as is typical on most boats, admittedly it's a serious design flaw, but it happens. Running the engine to provide power, whether via the alternator to the batteries or directly for an engine-driven system, will actually heat up the box and cause you to need even more power to cool it down. The same is true if the refrigerator is next to a generator compartment. Relatively few boats opt for engine-driven refrigeration anymore. With an engine-driven system, you run the engine a couple of times a day, generally for about 30 to 60 minutes at a time, to cool down large chill plates that keep the box cool until the next run time. There are several disadvantages to that system. You're tied to a schedule for running the engine, even if you're at the dock, anchored, or sailing along with plenty of wind. The temperature in the box fluctuates over the course of the day, particularly in warm climates. It's almost impossible to have a truly good freezer with an engine-driven system. And if you have a problem with your engine, you've just lost your refrigerator as well. And finally, there's the fuel cost and engine maintenance. They both add up, not to mention the extra engine hours you'll rack up. While some large boats opt for 110-volt systems using generators and inverters, and I've known a couple of trawlers and small catamarans that used RV propane systems. Our Gemini catamaran did that when we bought it, and we switched her to 12-volt. By far, the majority of family cruisers opt for 12-volt. That's why we switched it. A 12-volt system operates off the main battery bank, and power for it can be generated any way you'd otherwise charge the batteries. Solar, wind, a towing generator, alternator, shore power, or a generator. Most boats use a combination of those charging sources, and virtually all have to increase their power generation capabilities when they install refrigeration if they haven't had it before. Now, 2 things to consider with a 12-volt system. If you are heading from a relatively cool climate to a hot one, say going from San Francisco to the Sea of Cortez or Maine to the Caribbean, expect to use a lot more power for your refrigeration than you're accustomed to. Many boats coming to the Sea of Cortez found themselves scurrying to add solar panels or buy a generator as the weather warmed up. Now make sure that your battery bank is sized for the load you'll be putting on it. Every system is different as to how efficient it is, but it's likely that you'll need 100 amp hours or more a day just for the refrigerator if you're in a hot climate. Okay, let's talk about the compressor. More and more boat refrigerators is coming as all-in-one units, but many still do have a separate compressor. If you choose a model with a separate compressor, it's worth taking a bit of time to think about where you can and where you should place the compressor. Yes, you have to find a spot where there's room, and that may seriously limit the choices, but don't just opt for the first place you find. In simple terms, most compressors work by transporting heat from the refrigerant to the air around it. It'll operate much more efficiently if there is good airflow around the compressor, and if it is kept as cool as possible, and if the air that reaches it is as cool as possible. Therefore, putting the compressor in the engine compartment is not good, nor is putting it in any enclosed location with only small louvers for air circulation. Now, a few systems use a keel cooler that transfers heat to the water instead of air cooling. With these, there is little choice in placement, and you just do what they say to do. Now, you also have to consider distance from the refrigerator box, as the refrigerant has to make a full loop from the compressor to the evaporator in the box and back. Bends in the tubing and also a long distance make for more resistance to the circulation of the refrigerant, and hence a less efficient system. That, in turn, is going to raise the power consumed. Be sure to check the specs before buying a compressor to be sure it will work in your planned location. And another important consideration is access for maintenance, recharging the system, and other repairs. Okay. Access is never good on a boat, but at least don't put it where you have to stand on your head or dismount the compressor to check a trouble light or recharge the system. How about the box? 10 years ago, maybe 15, the box for most boat refrigerators was custom made. Now, far more are drop-in units. Either way, though, you do have a number of choices to make. The first is whether you're going to have top loading or front loading. If you're used to a shore refrigerator, front loading just seems so much more natural. And yes, it is easier to see what's in there. But front loaders have a nasty tendency to have food fall out if the boat moves while the door is open, and you need to install clear plastic strips to keep as much cold air in the refrigerator as possible when the door is open. The opening needs to be either fore or aft facing in the cockpit. Otherwise, everything will fall out on one tack or the other. Now, after taking a bit of time to get used to it, I actually preferred my top loader. Right now I have a front loader, and I wish I was back with that top loader. With a bunch of bins to keep things organized, I could find things quickly, and they stayed in place no matter what tack we were in or how rough the seas. I was even able to open the refrigerator and make sandwiches while we were riding out a hurricane at anchor and rolling gunnel to gunnel. Seriously. A current boat, we have the front loader, and I'm struck by how much more often I have to defrost, because every time I open the door, warm, moist air rushes in. Okay, let's talk about the size of the boat refrigerator. To some extent, a smaller refrigerator is more efficient as there is less space to cool. And yes, having a refrigerator full of cold items as opposed to air is more efficient. But you also need some air space in the refrigerator for that cool to circulate. And if things are so tightly packed that you have to remove half of what's in the refrigerator to get the item you need out, that's not efficient either. A very deep refrigerator, particularly one that's top loading, is also problematic. One of the top gripes for many women is standing on my head to get things out of the fridge bottom. And let's face it, you want a refrigerator that's large enough to hold what you want it to. And that's a personal feeling. You may want enough meat, drinks, and whatnot for a month at a time, or just food for a weekend. Okay, let's talk about location. If you're just redoing the refrigerator, you're probably more or less locked into a location. But if you're redoing the galley, the top priority should be to keep the refrigerator away from the engine compartment. Second priority would be to keep the refrigerator away from the hull and the sun heating it up. The more it's away from anywhere the sun will beat down on it, such as next to the companionway, the better. Insulation. In general, and it's pretty simple, the thicker and higher the R value, the better. Materials are constantly evolving, so I can't make a specific recommendation. And of course, if you have a limited space, the thickness of insulation is a trade-off with space inside the refrigerator. Okay, a little bit about general design. A lid that latches down instead of just being held by gravity or a magnetic strip. That's best for your boat refrigerator, along with a thick, heavy gasket. Far less cold will seep out. The lid won't fly across the boat in a knockdown either. An outside surface, otherwise known as the surround, that reflects heat will also do wonders to help your refrigerator run more efficiently. On K-Tal, our first boat, we had a teak surround that just frequently got hot to the touch, and you know it had to be transferring heat into the refrigerator that was then trying to be cooled down. If you decide to put a drain in the bottom for when you need to defrost, absolutely it must have a trap in it, and the trap needs to be within the insulated area. An alternative is to be able to securely close the drain. Otherwise, hot air from the bilge, well, maybe not hot, but hotter than what's in the refrigerator, will rise into the refrigerator. Remember, hot air rises. It's going to rise from the bilge into the refrigerator, and you will be constantly having to cool it. Okay, the freezer. There are all sorts of design possibilities for either having a separate freezer or a freezer compartment within the refrigerator. The size of the freezer generally determines how much meat you can carry, as well as how many meals you can prepare ahead for a passage. But it takes a lot of energy to freeze foods in the first place, although not a lot to keep a full freezer frozen. My freezer was about a half a cubic foot, okay, tall, and I found it adequate, but I would have loved a larger one. Now, on Barefoot Gal, I use an Engel portable unit as a dedicated freezer, and I love it. It'll even freeze ice cream, even on the hottest days. Okay, let's talk about the brand. The longer we cruised, the more adamant we became about buying brands and models within brands that lots of other cruisers were using or that were composed of generic parts. Regardless of whether it was refrigeration or another system, we found over and over again that having something that other people, both helpful cruisers and local repairmen, knew of and could get parts for, was worth not necessarily having the latest and greatest. Good repair manuals that you can actually get, off-the-shelf parts, and universal fittings are crucial once you're away from the original installer. I also like companies that will respond to technical support by email. The time to think about these issues is before you plunk your money down. As you work through these questions, you'll almost certainly have to make some compromises to end up with a boat refrigeration system that works for you. The trick is to realize the trade-offs as you are making them, and not after the fact when things aren't working the way you envisioned. For example, a tiny box with thick insulation won't use much power, but will it give you the food and drinks you want? A refrigerator is an expensive piece of galley equipment, even more so if you have to add extra batteries and upgrade your power generation. As brands and models are always changing, I don't want to recommend specific systems. But as you talk to sales reps and read about various models, realize there are numerous components to the refrigeration system, and choices in each one affect the others, as well as your ultimate satisfaction. If you found this episode of the Boat Galley podcast helpful to you, please tell your friends about it and also subscribe in your podcast player. Thanks so much. Until next time.